There is a weight you have been carrying for days. And the most disturbing thing is not the weight itself. It is that you cannot name where it comes from. It is not sadness with an identifiable cause. It is not anxiety over something specific. It is a diffuse, dull pressure that is in everything and nowhere at the same time. You wake up with it. You go to sleep with it. Sometimes you look at your own life from the outside, as if from afar, and you feel that something is ending without you being conscious of exactly what is ending. If you recognize this state, I need you to understand one thing now before anything else that this video will bring you. This weight is not depression. It is not clinical anxiety. It is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is the atmospheric pressure that precedes a rupture. It is the kind of sensation that geologists study when they analyze the behavior of the soil before an earthquake. An accumulation of underground force that has no visible outlet yet, but which is transforming the structure of everything inside, silently, in a way that will change the topography of your life in a way you do not yet have eyes to imagine. And here is what no one has told you clearly enough yet. You are not being redirected. You are being removed. These are completely different things. Redirection adjusts the path within the same map you already know. Removal takes you completely off the territory. It places you in a geography that does not exist on any map you have studied to this day. And the disorientation you feel, that deep confusion about who you are, where you belong, what comes next, is not weakness. It is the natural and completely expected response of someone navigating virgin terrain in a stretch of the journey that no previous version of you had ever stepped upon. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what I am going to show you will change not only the way you understand what you are living now, it will change the way you will look back 5 years from now and see this period with a clarity that today seems impossible. If you are not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now. Here we do not work with easy answers to difficult questions. We go deep where most content does not have the courage to go. Subscribe and stay close. Before going to the stories and the concepts that will anchor everything you are feeling, I need to show you that what you are experiencing is not just a spiritual experience. It is a phenomenon that science also documents and that has a name, structure, and pattern. Enoch has published extensive research on what psychologists call identity transition periods in adults over 35 years old. Researchers discovered something that surprises those unfamiliar with this area. The periods of greatest subjective disorientation, those in which the person cannot clearly identify who they are or where they belong, do not correspond to moments of greatest objective crisis. On the contrary, frequently, the periods of greatest inner confusion happen exactly when the person is on the threshold of a significant identity transition that will represent deep and irreversible growth. In other words, confusion does not precede defeat, it precedes transformation. The researchers identified that during these transitions, the individual experiences what they called the dissolution of provisional identity structures, structures that were useful in a previous phase of life, but that have become incompatible with what the person is becoming. This dissolution produces the sensation of nameless weight, of strangeness in relation to one's own life, of reduced belonging to the spaces and people that previously seemed so natural. And this sensation, which most people interpret as a sign that something is wrong, is actually the most reliable marker that a genuine and profound transformation is underway. You are not breaking. You are being dismantled for a reconstruction that the environment where you were did not have the capacity to produce. There is a word in Hebrew that carries the weight of everything you are living now. The word is lakach. It is generally translated as to take, to carry, to remove. But in Hebrew, it does not describe an ordinary taking. Lakach, when used with God as the subject, describes an act of removal that is simultaneously an act of honor. It is the gesture of one who withdraws something from a context to place it in a context of greater dignity. It is the removal that is promotion, even when the one being removed cannot yet see where they are being taken. And the most extraordinary place where this word appears in all biblical literature is in one of the briefest and most enigmatic verses of Genesis. 5 words in Portuguese, even fewer in Hebrew. And Enoch walked with God, and he was no longer found, because God took him. God took him. Lakach, God removed Enoch. Now stop and think about Enoch's life before this verse. The text does not give us many details. There are no great battles, no spectacular miracles, no recorded prophetic speeches, no executed strategic plans. What the text repeats twice in just 3 verses is a simple and disconcerting phrase. Enoch walked with God. He did not run after God. He did not fight for God. He did not produce for God. He walked with God. This walk was enough for God to decide. This man can no longer continue in the space he is in. The environment where he exists does not have the capacity to contain what he has become. And so God removed him, not as punishment, not because Enoch failed, but because Enoch had reached a quality of communion with the divine that made him incompatible with the territory where he was. The strangeness you feel in relation to your own life now may be exactly that. Not a sign that you failed or that you lost something. A sign that you have grown beyond what the current environment can contain. You no longer fit because the mold became small, not because you shrank. Like this video now if this description touches something real in you. If you have ever felt that you became too big to fit into spaces that previously seemed exact for your size, the like helps this content reach other people who are living the same isolation and do not yet have the language to name what is happening to them. But I need to warn you about something dangerous that happens exactly in this interval, between the lakach, the removal, and the arrival at the new spiritual address. The enemy does not work with direct attacks. That is an illusion that leaves us unprotected against the real method he uses. The real method is much more subtle and much more efficient than any frontal attack. The real method is interpretation. He does not need to create the situation of isolation. You are already isolated because God removed you. He does not need to create the sensation of strangeness. You already feel strangeness because you are on virgin ground. What he does is much simpler and much more devastating. He whispers the wrong interpretation for everything you are already living. He takes the removal and says it is rejection. He takes the isolation and says it is abandonment. He takes the confusion and says it is evidence that you lost your way, that you erred, that you were not as special as you thought. He takes the silence of God and says that God went quiet because he gave up on you. And the cruelest part of this mechanism is that he does not need new lies. He only needs to put the wrong caption on true images. The image is real. You are isolated. The caption is false. You are being punished. The image is real. The people from your previous life are distant. The caption is false. They moved away because you are insufficient. PUCSP conducted studies on the interpretation processes of ambiguous events in periods of emotional transition and discovered a phenomenon that researchers called threat bias in liminal states. When a person is in a period of high uncertainty about their own identity, the brain has a systematic and documented tendency to interpret neutral or positive events as signs of danger, not out of malice or weakness. By neurological design, in a state of vulnerability, the nervous system prioritizes the detection of threats to protect the organism. The problem is that in this state, everything seems like a threat, including what is promotion. In other words, your biology in the period of removal will automatically conspire to make you read your situation as abandonment. And the only thing that breaks this cycle is a source of interpretation that is outside of your current emotional state. An external anchor that tells you what is really happening when your internal state is telling you the opposite. This video is one of those anchors. The word you are hearing now is one of those anchors. There is another word in Hebrew that you need to carry with you from today on. The word is Nazir, and it is the root of the concept of consecration by separation. The Nazir was someone who had been set apart for a specific purpose, and this separation produced a radically different visibility for those on the outside. The Nazir looked different, behaved differently, lived according to a set of rules that made him incomprehensible to those who did not understand what was happening to him. But Nazir was not punishment. It was the visible external response to an internal process of consecration. It was the sign that that person had entered a season of preparation so specific and so deep that their very lifestyle needed to reflect the singularity of what was being gestated in them. The isolation you feel may be your Nazir, your visible consecration, the external sign of an internal process so demanding and so specific that it cannot happen in the midst of the noise of normal social life, the commitments that drain without nourishing, the expectations of other people about who you should continue to be. God sometimes sets us apart not to punish us with loneliness, but to spare us from the voices that, with all the good intention in the world, would say things that would prevent us from advancing toward what we do not yet have the language to describe. Write in the comments now the word extracted, one word. Because by writing this word you are doing something much greater than it seems. You are naming the process correctly. You are saying that you understand that what is happening to you is not abandonment, it is not rejection, it is not failure. It is a divine extraction, a lakash, a removal to an address that the previous environment was not in a condition to produce. Write extracted and I will read it. Now I need to take you to a desert, not metaphorically, to a real desert with sand, with loneliness, with total silence, and with the absence of any evidence that your life was going somewhere worth the effort. Moses was 40 years old when he fled Egypt. He was a prince. He was educated in the best schools of the most advanced civilization of the then-known world. He had access to power, to privilege, to all the resources a person could desire. And then, in an act of poorly executed justice, he killed an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew, was discovered, and had to flee, from prince to fugitive, from palace to desert, in one day. What the text does not emphasize as much, but which is absolutely essential to understanding your own story, is what came after the flight. Moses spent 40 years in the desert of Midian as a shepherd. 40 years, 2/3 of a complete adult life, with no visible mission, no prophecies being fulfilled, no career progression, no sign that the dreams he probably carried about liberating his people were being prepared. 40 years of apparent irrelevance. And then one day, while tending the flock, Moses came to a mountain called Horeb, and he saw a bush that burned without being consumed. And when he approached to investigate, he heard a voice that said, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." The voice did not start with the mission. It started with the recognition of the place. The place where Moses was at that moment was holy ground, not the palace he had left behind, not the future that had not yet arrived, the desert where he was now, the place that in the eyes of any external observer seemed the place furthest from any divine purpose. And here is what I want you to see with all the clarity you have. Moses did not find the burning bush because he searched for it. The text says he was attracted. Something in the bush caught his attention. He turned to investigate. And it was in that turn, in that moment of curiosity and attention to what was happening around him, even in the desert, that the mission revealed itself. The 40 years in the desert were not a detour from the path. They were the school without which Moses would not have had the capacity to lead 2 million people through a desert much larger than the one where he had learned to survive. In the desert of Midian, he learned to read the land, to understand weather patterns, to find water where others would see nothing, to deal with animals that do not obey out of obligation, only out of trust. He was being trained for 40 years for a job that did not yet have a visible name. There is a word in Hebrew that describes exactly what was happening to Moses in that desert. The word is tzafan. It means to hide, to reserve, to keep in a protected place. It is not the hiding of the shameful. It is the hiding of the precious. It is the way a goldsmith keeps a rare material while it is in the process of preparation, away from eyes that would not understand what they are seeing and could, without bad intention, interfere in the process with hands that were not prepared to touch it. You are in tzafan now, kept, reserved. Hidden not because you are disposable, but because what is being formed in you is too precious to be exposed before it is ready. And the time of a tzafan is not calculated by a human calendar. It is calculated by the extent of the process that is happening inside. Activate the bell now so as not to miss the next video on this channel, because we are going to reveal something that directly completes what you are learning here. We will enter into the question of how you recognize the end of the preparation period, how you know when the time has come to leave the desert, and what is the most common mistake people make exactly at the moment of transition, when they are one step away from manifestation and retreat because they do not recognize the sign. Activate the bell now. The Institute of Noetic Sciences, an American organization dedicated to research in consciousness and human transformation, published a series of studies on the phenomenon they called reorganization of the self in periods of existential rupture. What the researchers documented was that the periods of greatest identity disorientation in adults correspond, in a significant proportion of the cases followed, to transitions that later the participants themselves described as the most positive turning points of their entire life trajectory. In other words, retrospectively, the period that seemed the darkest was the one that contained the greatest potential for growth. What differentiated the people who emerged, transformed from those who emerged traumatized, was not the intensity of the experience. It was the interpretation they made of it during the process. People who managed to attribute some meaning to the period of rupture, even if a provisional and incomplete meaning, even if a partial interpretation that could be revised later, had significantly more positive long-term results than those who remained without any interpretation at all. The language you are acquiring in this video is exactly that, an interpretation that allows you to cross the period without being destroyed by it. But I need to go to a deeper level now and talk about something that is perhaps the hardest part to accept of everything you are living. The process you are going through is not just changing what you do or where you are, it is changing who you are. And this is a surgery that hurts in a way for which no one adequately prepares us, because all our cultural formation, especially in Brazil, where identity is so strongly anchored in relationships, family, community, and belonging, has taught us that the continuity of the self is an absolute value, that being the same is a sign of integrity, that changing too much is a sign of instability. And so when we reach a period in which the transformation is so deep that the previous version of ourselves literally no longer fits in the version that is emerging, the process feels, on the inside, like a kind of death. And in truth it is. Scripture uses an image for this that Yeshua presented, and which is more radical than most people realize when they read quickly. He spoke about old wineskins and new wine, and he said that one does not put new wine into old wineskins, because the new wine will burst the old wineskin and the wine is lost. New wine needs new wineskins. This image has a technical dimension that most people do not notice. A wineskin was made of animal skin. When it was new, the leather was soft, flexible, capable of expanding along with the fermentation of the wine. But over time, the leather hardened. It lost elasticity. And an old wineskin exposed to new wine that was still in the process of fermentation could not keep up with the expansion. Not because it was inferior, because it had fulfilled its function so completely that it had reached the limit of its capacity for expansion. The version of you that learned to survive in the last season was an extraordinary wineskin for the wine it contained. It was exactly what it needed to be at that moment. That version that learned to shrink to fit into spaces that were too small, that learned to smile through pain so as not to bother others, that developed sophisticated protection mechanisms because the environment demanded it. It was extraordinary. It brought you here, but it can no longer expand. And what is being poured into you now is a new wine that will break any structure that does not have the flexibility to accompany it. And the sensation of breaking that you are feeling inside is exactly that. The old wineskin giving way to the new wineskin that is being formed along with the wine it will contain. Psychological Science, one of the world's leading scientific journals of psychology, published research on the concept of narrative identity in transition. Researchers discovered that the reformulation of the narrative of oneself, the process of rewriting who you are from a different perspective, is one of the most robust predictors of long-term psychological health. People who manage to reinterpret their past experiences, including the most difficult ones, within a narrative of growth and not of victimization, show significantly higher rates of well-being, resilience, and capacity to face future challenges. What science calls the reformulation of narrative identity, spiritual tradition calls the birth of a new identity. And there is a Hebrew word that captures this process with a precision that no translation can completely contain. The word is bara. Bara is the verb that Genesis uses in its first line. In the beginning, God created bara, the heavens and the earth. And what is extraordinary about this choice of word is that bara, in Hebrew, is used exclusively to describe a creation from nothing, not a transformation of something that already existed, not a reform of what was there. A creation that begins where there is nothing yet. When bara appears associated with God and a human being in prophetic texts, it describes a work that is not a reform of the previous version. It is a new creation that begins from the dissolution of what was before. That is why the process hurts with the intensity of an end, because it is an end, the end of the version that needed to finish so that the new creation could begin. There is a man in biblical history who lived the bara in a way that hardly finds a parallel in intensity. His original name was Abram. He was living in Ur of the Chaldeans, one of the most sophisticated and developed cities of his time, with family, with roots, with a well-defined identity within a culture and a worldview. And then he heard a voice that said something that, by any rational human criterion, seemed absurd in its incompleteness. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. Not go to such a place with such a mission and such a guaranteed resource, but leave to a place that I will show you later. The instruction did not contain the destination. It contained only the direction, and Abram left, without knowing where. At 75 years old, leaving behind everything that constituted his identity, his land, his people, his father's house. 3 layers of belonging removed at once, a removal so total that when he arrived in the land that God showed, he was explicitly called a foreigner by the Canaanites who already inhabited it. And it was in that condition of foreigner, of someone who belonged to neither of the 2 worlds, neither to the one he had left, nor to the one that was still being built, that God made a covenant with him that changed the direction of human history. And he changed his name from Abram to Abraham, from the name that defined who he was, to a name that defined what he was becoming, father of a multitude. The new name came in the middle of the crossing, not before leaving, not after arriving, in the middle, when he was still a foreigner in a strange land, without defined belonging, without complete clarity about the destination. It was exactly there that the new identity was pronounced over him. You may be in the middle now, no longer in what was, not yet arrived at what will be. And it is exactly in this place that the new identity begins to be pronounced. Do not wait to arrive to discover who you are becoming. The new name begins to be formed in the middle of the crossing. The Stanford Social Innovation Review published studies on periods of creative rupture in leaders who went through deep identity transformations and who, after emerging from them, produced significant social impact. One of the most consistent findings was that the period of greatest identity ambiguity, the one in which the individual could no longer clearly define themselves within the previous categories, but still had no clarity about the new ones, was invariably described retrospectively as the period of greatest internal growth, even if at the moment it seemed like the period of greatest external stagnation. The researchers used the expression productive liminality to describe this state. The interval between 2 identities where neither of the 2 is completely active, and where the tension between what was and what is being gestated produces a creative energy that neither of the 2 separate states would be capable of generating. You are in productive liminality. The tension you feel is not evidence that you are lost. It is the energy of a creation that is happening inside, in a dimension that has not yet become visible externally, but which is becoming so. And now I need to give you something practical. Because everything you have learned so far about Lakach, about Nazir, about Safan, about Bara, about Enoch, about Moses, about Abraham, needs to have a point of contact with your tomorrow. How do you navigate virgin terrain without a map? How do you advance in a geography of the soul, never before traversed without a guide who has already been there and returned? First thing, you stop demanding from yourself the clarity that this moment cannot give you. This seems simple, but it is one of the hardest things someone in transition can do, because we were trained to operate from clarity, not to act without knowing where we are going, not to invest without knowing what the return will be, not to trust without sufficient evidence. And so when we reach a period in which clarity is simply not available, because the destination does not yet exist on the map of any previous version of ours, the absence of clarity is interpreted as our failure, as a sign that we are not spiritual enough, intelligent enough, dedicated enough to understand what is happening. But Abraham left without knowing where. Moses turned toward the bush out of curiosity. not out of prior clarity that would be the moment of his commission. Enoch simply walked, without any indication that he was reaching a point of removal. Navigation in virgin terrain does not start with a map. It starts with the next available step. Second thing, you start treating silence as information, not as absence. The silence you feel around you now, the silence of God that sometimes seems unbearable, the silence of the people who moved away, the internal silence about what comes next, is one of the richest environments for the kind of formation that is happening in you. In silence, the voices that previously covered what you really felt and thought stop working. In silence, the expectations of others about who you should be lose the strength they had when they were repeated constantly. In silence, something begins to emerge that was always there but never had space to express itself. The quietest and truest voice of your own identity. Third thing, and the most important of all, you stop defending yourself against transformation. This is the most subtle and most decisive movement, because there is a part of us that, even when crying out for change, resists real transformation with all the strength it has. Because real transformation implies loss, not loss of bad things. Loss of things that were good and that now need to give way to what will be better. Loss of identities that were useful and that now need to be dissolved. Loss of belongings that were nourishing in one season and that are now keeping you too small for what you are becoming. Stopping defending yourself against transformation means letting the old wineskin crack without trying to fix it. It means allowing what is being dismantled to be dismantled without interrupting the process with solutions that only postpone the inevitable. It means trusting that what God is creating, the Bera that is underway, is more solid and more worthy of trust than any structure you could preserve on your own. You are attracted to this video today in the same way Moses was attracted to the bush that burned, not by accident, not by algorithm, because something inside you already knows that you are being removed for something greater, and was looking for the language that would confirm what this internal something already knew. The pressure you feel is not the weight of the end. It is the weight of the beginning of something that does not yet have a name in your experience. It is the atmospheric pressure of a rupture that will make sense to you later in the way earthquakes make sense to geologists after they happen. The point of rupture reveals the extent of the transformation that was already happening underneath, silently, long before any visible sign on the surface. You are not being abandoned. You are being extracted to a spiritual address that the previous environment could not accommodate. Isolation is not your end of the story. It is the necessary condition for a beginning that will surprise even the people who have known you the longest. Share this video now with someone who is living this weight without being able to name what it is. Someone who is interpreting their own removal as rejection, their own nazir as punishment, their own tzafan as being forgotten. Because sometimes the most transformative thing you can do for another person is to place in their hand the correct interpretation for what they are living. And this interpretation can completely change what they do with the time that remains in this period. And write in the comments extracted. Because you know now what is happening to you. You are not lost, you were removed, you are being gathered. You are in tzafan, kept as precious while the process of bara is happening inside. And when the moment of your bush arrives, when the flame that is not consumed appears on the path you are traversing, you will be ready to take off your sandals and listen, because you will already know how to recognize the voice that speaks from the fire. Until the next video.